Hello, you're on Pablo Spot. I'm George. Welcome to a new series where I tackle ECS infrastructure to orchestrate Docker containers. Today's episode will be a show and tell on setting up the core ECS infrastructure that will orchestrate Docker containers needed to run a WordPress web application. And so if this series and the content of this channel lines up with your interests, hit the subscribe button and join me in this journey of learning by doing. So, let's start coding. Before I start, let me quickly point out that there are a lot of components in setting up a full infrastructure stack that involves AWS ECS. What I intend to do is break this down into logical components, and today I will only cover what's involved in writing Terraform code to set up all the main ECS infrastructure. The baseline infrastructure that I will use in today's episode will come from the same infrastructure that I have written to set up my WordPress website infrastructure. So I suggest checking out this episode, which you can access right here. So what I have essentially set up includes a backend database that is using a serverless RDS. And then I have the actual WordPress application in Docker. This is the actual component that talks directly to my database. Then I also have the Nginx acting as a proxy to my WordPress application. Both of these applications are actually set up to run inside a publicly accessible EC2 instance. And finally, I have configured a Cloudflare resource to expose my WordPress application to the internet with a domain-based URL. This Cloudflare resource is actually pointing to my publicly accessible EC2 instance. This setup is not fault tolerant. If my only EC2 instance dies, my WordPress web application becomes totally unusable. So what I need to do is set up a mechanism to allow for new EC2 instances to spin up automatically when one of the EC2 instances dies. So this is where auto-scaling resource comes in. And because I will end up with multiple EC2 instances, I need to funnel requests to any available EC2 instance that can serve my requests. And this is where I need a load balancer. My WordPress application and my Nginx application are both set up with Docker. So I need a facility to take care of configuring both Docker applications inside each of my EC2 instances automatically. And so this is where we need ECS for. Let's start doing the actual work. Note that I will be building up from the code that I have from episode 8. And so first thing I would do is clone the files that I need into a new directory and pull only the files relevant to WordPress infrastructure. So I'll run git clone this way. Now I'm going to cd to the new directory that I have created called WordPress ECS Infra. And then what I need to do next is pull only the files from episode 8 WordPress infrastructure by running this command. If I list down the downloaded files in this directory, it shows me the directory for the code that I created for episode 8. I'll rename this directory to db. And now I can open VS Code from this directory. In the root of this workspace, I'll create a new directory and call it ECS. And then I'll open my terminal, cd to ECS, and run my script to generate shell Terraform code for my module. Now, let me close this terminal and then expand this ECS directory on my VS Code Explorer and then start updating my code. I'll start with my backend.tf and set the Terraform cloud as the place to store my state files. And now I'll open my main.tf and start writing the necessary code for my ECS infrastructure. The first resource that I need to create is the ECS cluster. I'm sourcing the value of my name property from a variable, so I'll have to set the definition in my variables.tf. And that's all I need for my cluster resource. Now back to my main.tf. The next resource that I need to set up is my ECS service. The first property I'm going to set on this resource is the name property to identify this resource from all other ECS services. I have to go to my variables.tf and define this service name variable. Now back to my main.tf. The next property I need to set is cluster. The cluster property is a string value that points to the name of the cluster, which means I can actually set the value of this property to the variable cluster name. There is a problem with this though. When I start standing up the infrastructure, both my ECS cluster and ECS service could be created at the same time. and this will fail. I want the ECS service to be created after the ECS cluster is created. So in order to set an implicit dependency between my ECS cluster resource and my ECS service, I will source the value of the cluster property from the cluster resource like this. The next property is launch type. I'm going to set up my ECS infrastructure to use EC2 instances, so I'm going to use the same value for my launch type. And then now the next property to set is the task definition. This property needs to point to an ECS task definition resource, so I need to create this. For the family property, I will set the source of this value from a variable. And then I have to go to my variables.tf and set the definition for this variable. Now back to my main.tf. The next property to set is the networking mode, which is essentially the mode of the Docker networking to use. Docker has a default networking mode of bridge, which is what I'm going to use for this property. The next property to set is requires compatibilities property, so I'll set this to a list with a string EC2. There are other properties that I have to add inside my task definition, starting with the execution role ARN. This property needs to point to a role resource that contains all the necessary permissions that my tasks require. I'm going to set the name property as a concatenated string of some prefix, the task family, and the Terraform workspace. This resource needs to assume a role policy specific to an AWS service. This assume role policy property will be derived from a data reference, so let me head over to my data.tf and define this. This data reference indicates that this particular policy is assumed by any ECS task resource. So now let me go back to my main.tf and update the reference to my IAM role resource. My task role also needs a set of policy definition for the actual permissions in accessing other AWS services. So I'm going to add an inline policy block property. I will define JSON encoded policy statements that define permissions to ECR resources. I can then go back to my ECS task definition and update the execution role ARN. So now back to my ECS task definition. In my previous setup of my WordPress infrastructure, I have custom configuration files that my Docker applications use. And so I need to allow my Docker containers to have access to my EC2 instance disk via this volume block. There will be instances when I don't need to set this property. What I need to achieve this is to use dynamic block. The source for my for each property in this block will be from a local parameter. Let me head over to my locals.tf and set this parameter. What this volume mapping indicates is that the path inside my EC2 instance called var/nginx will be mounted to the path etc nginx-conf-d inside the container. I'll head back to my main.tf and then assign the value elements to the host path and the name properties. The next property for my ECS task definition that I need to set is the container definition. This property is a JSON formatted value that represents a list of container definitions. I have two Docker containers that I need to set. So I'm going to start with the basic set of container properties for both applications. I need to expose my nginx Docker container port. So this is achieved by setting port mappings on the container definition for nginx. On this particular property, I'll set the container port to 80, which is the default application port exposed by nginx on the Docker image, and then set the host port to the same value. If I go back to my old WordPress application, which I renamed to DB, and open this Docker Compose file right here, I have environment variables that my WordPress container application consumes, and I need these environment variables set on my WordPress container definition. I will set the environment variables that are not necessarily sensitive, like DB host, user, and the DB name. So let me go back to my main.tf. The values for each of these environment variables are stored in parameter store in Systems Manager. So back to my DB directory, and inside WordPress, I'm going to open main.tf. I have 3 parameter store entries in here for my DB name, master user, and password, but I don't have the one for the host. So I need to add another one to set the DB host in here. The value will be derived from the RDS resource endpoint. What I'm going to do next is copy all these 4 parameter store entries and then open data.tf on my ECS module and then paste them all here. And because I need all of these to be data references, I will need to change this from resource to data and remove the unnecessary elements. And now I can go back to the main.tf of my ECS module and update my environment variables to use the appropriate data reference. Because the DB password environment variable is sensitive, I will be adding this in the secrets property instead of the environment. What I need is pass the ARN property of the parameter store record to the value from property. I'm going to finish the rest of the container definition properties for my Nginx. If I go back to my Docker Compose file, I run a custom command to start my Nginx application, and then head back to my main.tf. And on the container definition for my Nginx, I will add the command property and paste what I copied. I need to set mount point property that points to the volume mapping that I've set on my task definition earlier. And so to set mount points, I need to look through the local volume mapping parameter and assign source volume, container path, and the read-only flag. The next thing that I'm going to do is very important, and this is to send logging for both my containers to CloudWatch. So let me head to the end of this file and create the CloudWatch log resource. I can now head back to my container definitions and update logging configuration. So starting with my WordPress container definition, the options block is set with the appropriate region. The log group is pointing to the CloudWatch log resource that I just created, and I set the stream prefix to WordPress to consolidate all the logs coming from my WordPress container. So let me copy this same block over to my Nginx container definition. I'm going to change the stream prefix and set it to Nginx. And that's the bare minimum setup that I need for my task definition. I can now go back to my ECS service resource and update the task definition ARN property to point to this new resource. The next property I need to set is the desired count property. This determines how many tasks I need to run all the time. So for my case, I'll set the value of this property to 2. I need to add load balancer property to my service, so it will look like this. This load balancer will be hitting my Nginx container, so I'll set the container name to Nginx. And with the port mapping that I've set earlier, I'll set the container port to 80. As for the target group ARN, I will set this up to fetch the value from a variable. And now I need to go to my variables.tf and set a definition for this new variable. And that's my Terraform module for my ECS infrastructure. But before I wrap up this episode, let me try to validate the module and fix any issues that we find in the code. So I'll open my terminal, and then I'll run Terraform init without backend. This is a common issue that I experience with new repositories, so let me fix this by going to the root of my repository and run asdf command to set up my Terraform binaries. And now I'm going to go back to ECS and run my Terraform init again. And now I'm going to run Terraform validate, and all my configurations are good. I've squeezed quite a lot on this episode, so let's have a logical break at this point. And on the next episode, I will pick up from this point and look into setting up the auto-scaling related resources as well as load balancer, which are essential to the overall orchestration of my Docker containers using ECS. In the meantime, let me know your thoughts in the comments below and send me some likes if you find this useful. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you like the content of this channel. Until next time, and as always, keep learning and stay safe. See ya.